So some factors that are related to speech sound disorders. We know that, well, we don't actually know that cognitive impairments are not quite conclusive. So we may see some differences when we have a cognitive impairment, especially in toddlers. And we may also see the presence of differences in when children have specific syndromes, such as Down syndrome. We do see that children with speech sound disorder are at greater risk for language impairments, and that speech sound disorders can impact learning to read and learning to write. For reasons we don't quite understand yet, being a boy is more common. A child with speech sound disorders is more likely to be a boy, or boys are more likely to have a speech sound disorder. And we also see that boys have a somewhat later acquisition of consonants, depending on the study, but this is a trend that up to about the age of 6, girls tend to be a little bit further ahead in what consonants they've acquired compared to the boys of the same age. We do see that individuals with hearing loss or hearing impairment are more likely to have a speech sound disorder. And it does depend on the age of the hearing loss, and the use of a hearing aid, and the training or rehabilitation that the child receives. And we do see that differences in anatomy and muscular innervation of the jaw, lips, tongue, hard, soft palate will impact speech. So for example, a child with a cleft palate is likely to have a speech sound disorder. So when we assess speech sound disorders, what are we trying to do? We're trying to determine whether treatment is needed and what approach should be used. So there's 2 main pieces of information we're trying to get. To do that, to do a complete assessment, we need to know the child's speech sound system. We need to identify some related factors and some prognostic indicators. So to describe this child's speech sound system, we're going to do a speech sound inventory. So understand what vowels and consonants the child is able to produce and in what types of syllables, what position of words. The sound error inventory, so what phonological patterns is the child producing? Are they regular? Is there consistency or inconsistency in those error patterns? Because that helps us distinguish between speech phonological disorders from childhood apraxia of speech, for example. Look at the phonological pattern analysis, so what's more frequent, and the general intelligibility, which is a bigger picture part of to what extent is the child's speech differences impacting their participation. We will also want to identify related factors, so screen or assess for language abilities, so using tasks depending on the child's age that looks at their oral language and their written language. And we'll also use some parent questionnaires to ask about the child's more general development, to be able to identify some of those other factors that may influence their speech development. So for example, has the child had frequent ear infections which impacted their hearing of speech or hearing more generally? Did the child, has that child had a hearing screening or a hearing assessment? Does the child have, as far as the anatomy goes, the good, or not good, but typical innervation of their muscles? Are their structures within the normal range, or are there some differences that may help us to understand their speech sound differences? And then we'll look at some prognostic indicators. So while consistency is on one level is a way to help us understand the difference between a phonological disorder and childhood apraxia of speech. It's not the only piece, which is important to keep in mind. But seeing some inconsistency can also be a positive prognostic indicator. So a child that is a little bit inconsistent, maybe learning a new phoneme and producing it occasionally well. So it's important to think about inconsistency as being it's not all or nothing. We need to probe a little bit more on that level. Stimulability is another key prognostic indicator. So a child that can produce a phoneme with coaching, support, and a model, that's a positive sign. It suggests that they're in the process of learning that new sound. And perceptual discrimination is another key part. So when a child can discriminate or distinguish between two speech sounds that they're not producing differently. So for example, a child that is not producing the S sound, so instead of C, they say T. Well, are they able to perceive the difference between T and C? Surprisingly, a number of children are not perceiving that difference. So the speech sound error may be a little bit further up in their system of not having kind of developed those categories for both of those speech sounds. And we'll talk about perceptual discrimination, so an external error, so somebody else, for example, I as a speech language pathologist producing those two sounds, can the child hear the difference between them? And then can the child hear the difference between their own speech, which is another level of complexity. So we work and through our assessment to get all this information, and the complete assessment will help us provide evidence to support the identification of a speech sound disorder, and then often a subtype, so whether it's a phonological disorder, childhood apraxia of speech, or dysarthria. And it will also help us provide evidence to plan our treatment. So let's talk a little bit about that. So treatment for speech sound disorders can influence the choice of targets. So, sorry, let me start over again. So the key questions to understand when we're choosing our treatment approach is the core deficit. So is it more of a phonological disorder, childhood apraxia of speech, or dysarthria? Where are we providing the assessment? How often are we providing the assessment? So where is it in a private clinic? Is it in a child's school or daycare? How often? So how often? Once a week, every 2 days? Is it a daily or intensive assessment? How long is each session? How many sessions? So do we have a total of 8, or do we can go on for as long as we need to? And are we working one-on-one with the child or in a group? So these are key questions that where we gather information as a clinician to start understanding what's the best treatment approach. Although the book will talk about treatment approach first, and then choice of targets first and then treatment approach, the treatment approach itself can influence the choice of targets. So actually starting with an idea of what treatment approach we want to target will help us think about that choice of targets. So starting by thinking about what is the most appropriate treatment approach given all this information, and then what are the treatment targets going to be. So the treatment approaches that exist really range from a more language or phonological oriented down to more motor or articulatory oriented approaches. So I've produced these or represented them along this continuum. And I think it's important to think about, well, if you have a child with dysarthria, which is thought of as more of a motor speech disorder, speech sound disorder, we are more likely to focus on an articulation, a treatment approach that is towards this end of the continuum rather than one that's at this end, which is more language or phonological. And this end would be more appropriate for a child with a phonological disorder, for example. So let's work through, there's about 5 key approaches that are presented in the book. Of course, there are many others, but I think this provides a good overlay or overview of what exists. So language-based approaches where there's no explicit targeting of speech. It uses meaningful play and reading, and because it's not actually targeting specific speech sounds, it's not recommended for moderate to severe speech sound disorders, but it may help in generalizing. So by putting these newly acquired speech sounds into a real life context. Then we have a more phonological base, so different types of approaches like cycles, minimal pairs, maximal contrast, metaphon. and complexity first are some of the approaches within the phonological based. So these will explicitly target speech sounds. They have different strategies for identifying which errors we're going to prioritize within a child's speech sound system, and then a lot of evidence about why we prioritize one error or another over another. Because each approach has some different ways of being implemented, I think it's helpful to know an array of these because you can adjust your approach to what the treatment context is going to be, what's going to work best within your treatment context. And these approaches are good for children that have multiple errors. So mild, moderate, and severe will benefit from a phonological based approach, when especially children with phonological disorder. The DTTC is dynamical tactile cueing, and it's an intensive motor and drill-based approach that targets a few functional words and phrases. It's particularly been used for, or developed for use with children who have childhood apraxia of speech. And because it works on some functional words and phrases, it really helps that child build a base to be able to improve their ability to participate in their daily life, because they're getting that functional base of words and phrases that they can use to play with their peers, to interact with their teachers, to interact with their parents and siblings. The bottom-up drill approach is a focus on a specific phoneme one at a time. So if a child, we sometimes still see this used for children that have one or a few errors. So if a child has a difficulty producing an S, we're going to start and build up that S through perception, through production at the single word, in bigger word context, and then all the way up to the sentence, but one sound at a time. So you can imagine if a child has 4, 5, 10 different types of consonants that are in error, that this process would be really inefficient and take a long time. So this is why it's good for one or a few errors, but if there's multiple errors, let's move it up and think of either, if it's more of a childhood apraxia of speech context, DTTC, or phonological based. We have seen more in, I guess, the last 15 years or so, the Lee Silverman treatment approach, which is developed to use in particular for adults with Parkinson's and to produce a big, strong voice. And there have been some adaptations to children with cerebral palsy. So this is an approach that requires additional training for speech-language pathologists, but is worth investigating if you're working frequently with children that have dysarthria. So that gets a bit of an overview of the different types of approaches and why we would choose one over the other. So just to conclude, on the surface, producing speech sounds may seem easy. We do it all the time, and we produce hundreds of speech sounds per minute, let alone per hour, let alone per day. We are doing it all the time. It's highly practiced. We're really good at it. It requires rapid coordination of our articulators. It requires good perceptual abilities, being able to hear the speech sounds and adjust and be able to produce them, and strong phonological representations. And like I said, practice. We practice speech sounds from and producing speech from the moment we're born. That highly practiced part makes it seem easy, but it's really quite a challenging and a challenging system for children to learn. And it's a really exciting and challenging system to study and to do research in as well. So, don't be fooled. It's super exciting and really interesting. And clinically, it's also just so fascinating to work with young children and school-age children to explore and to support them in learning to speak, because it really does open up doors and provide them that platform for greater participation in school, at home, with friends in a community. And I hope you have a chance to learn more about it as you move forward through your studies. So thank you, and enjoy the next parts of the course.